The rapid crack of a bullwhip silenced the busy main street of Silvercreek, Colorado, as Sheriff Jedediah Blackwood dragged Nora Thompson by her auburn hair through the muddy thoroughfare, her torn dress trailing in the dirt behind her. It was 1876, and in this dusty frontier town, the sheriff's word was law, a law Nora had dared to defy. "You refused my proposal for the last time, Miss Thompson," the sheriff snarled, his breath hot against her face, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Time you learned what happens to women who don't know their place." Blood trickled from Nora's split lip as she struggled against his iron grip. At 22, she'd spent the last year since her father's death fending off the sheriff's unwanted advances while trying to keep her small dressmaking shop afloat. Her green eyes, though filled with tears, flashed defiance. "I'd rather die than marry you," she spat, earning another vicious slap that sent her sprawling into the mud. The townsfolk looked on, fear keeping them rooted in place as Sheriff Blackwood unbuckled his belt. Nobody dared cross the man who'd ruled Silvercreek with his particular brand of corruption and violence for nearly a decade. Nobody except the stranger who'd just ridden into town. That's enough. The voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority that cut through the tension like a knife. Heads turned toward the tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion. Dust covered from the trail and dressed in simple riding clothes. Nothing about him seemed particularly remarkable, except for the confident way he moved and the intensity in his blue eyes as they locked on the scene before him. "This ain't your business, stranger," Blackwood sneered, hand hovering near his holstered pistol. "Move along if you know what's good for you." The newcomer stepped closer, and despite his trail-worn appearance, there was something in his posture that gave even the sheriff pause. "When a man beats a woman in the street, I make it my business," he replied, extending his hand toward Nora. She looked up at him through tangled hair, uncertain whether to trust this unexpected intervention. The stranger's gaze softened as it met hers. With deliberate calm, he reached down, took her trembling hand in his, and said the words that would change everything. "You're mine." It was a declaration not of possession, but of protection, a shield raised against Blackwood's cruelty. The tension in the air was palpable as Nora slowly stood, still holding the stranger's hand. "I don't know who you think you are," Blackwood snarled, "but this woman is under my protection now," the stranger finished, his voice level but leaving no room for argument. "Name's Hayes Foster. Just rode in from Denver. I believe the lady has made her wishes clear." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You've just made a powerful enemy, Foster." Hayes didn't flinch. "Wouldn't be the first time." Blackwood spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." He turned on his heel and stormed off toward the saloon, his deputies following like obedient dogs. Only when the sheriff was out of sight did Hayes release Nora's hand. "Are you hurt badly, madam?" Nora touched her swollen lip, wincing. "I'll survive. I've endured worse from him." She studied the man before her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "My mother taught me that standing by while evil happens makes you complicit in it," he replied simply. "Is there somewhere safe I can take you?" Nora glanced nervously around at the townsfolk who were beginning to disperse, avoiding her eyes. "My shop is just down the street. I live in the rooms above it." As they walked, Nora fighting the urge to lean on this stranger for support, she felt the weight of curious stares. Hayes Foster led his horse behind them, seeming unconcerned by the attention. "You realize he won't let this go," she said quietly. "Blackwood isn't a man who forgives." Hayes nodded. "I figured as much. Men like him rarely do." "And what kind of man are you, Mr. Foster?" Nora couldn't help asking. A shadow crossed his face. "Just a man trying to make things right where I can." They reached Nora's shop, a modest establishment with Thompson's dressmaking painted on a wooden sign above the door. Inside, bolts of fabric lined the walls and a half-finished dress hung on a mannequin. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious of her simple surroundings. "It's honest work," Hayes replied, his gaze taking in the neat workspace. "That's more than can be said for many in these parts." Nora filled a basin with water and began cleaning her face, wincing as the cloth touched her bruised skin. "You said you rode in from Denver. What brings you to Silvercreek?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. I'm tracking someone, a man who killed my brother last year. Nora lowered the cloth. I'm sorry. Thomas was a U.S. Marshal, Hayes continued. He was investigating corruption along the frontier. Someone didn't like his questions. And you think this someone is in Silvercreek? Hayes nodded slowly. Information led me here. I wasn't planning on making my presence known so dramatically, but he gestured to her injured face. Some things can't be ignored. So you're a lawman too? Nora asked. Was left the badge behind for this. His expression darkened. This is personal. A knock at the door made them both tense. Hayes moved his hand to his holster, but Nora shook her head. It's all right, she said, recognizing the pattern. She opened the door to reveal an elderly woman holding a small basket. Mrs. Wilson, Nora greeted her. I brought you some of my healing salve, dear, the old woman said, her eyes widening at the sight of Hayes. And I see you have company. This is Mr. Foster, Nora said. He helped me with a situation involving the sheriff. Mrs. Wilson's expression grew grave. The whole town's talking about it. You're either very brave or very foolish, young man. Hayes inclined his head. Been called both, madam. Well, Blackwood's over at the saloon getting liquored up and making threats. Mrs. Wilson handed Nora the basket. You'd best be careful, both of you. That man has the county judge in his pocket and half the businessmen paying him protection. After Mrs. Wilson left, Nora applied the salve to her bruises, the herbal scent filling the small room. You have friends here, Hayes observed. A few, Nora admitted. Most people are too afraid of Blackwood to openly side with me. How long has he been after you? Nora's hands stilled. Since my father died last year, Pa was the only gunsmith in town. Blackwood seems to think that entitles him to the business and to me. Her voice hardened. I've been refusing him for months. Today he decided he was tired of asking. Hayes's expression darkened. A man who'd beat a woman for refusing him doesn't deserve to wear a badge. No law against it out here, Nora said bitterly. Besides, who would stop him? Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. You should rest, Hayes said finally. I'll find a room at the hotel. Nora shook her head. Blackwood owns the hotel. They won't rent to you now. She hesitated. There's a small storeroom behind the shop. It's not much, but... I've slept worse places, Hayes assured her. Thank you. As night fell over Silvercreek, Hayes sat cleaning his revolver in the small storeroom, the single lantern casting long shadows. He'd spent the last few hours observing the town from Nora's back window, noting the positions of the sheriff's men posted nearby. A soft knock preceded Nora's entrance, carrying a tray with a simple meal. It's not much, but you must be hungry. Very kind of you, Hayes said, setting aside his gun. You didn't have to. Least I could do. She set down the tray and lingered, clearly wanting to say more. Something on your mind, Miss Thompson. What you said earlier in the street. She began hesitantly. When you told the sheriff I was yours, why did you say it like that? Hayes considered his words carefully. It seemed the quickest way to make him back down. Men like Blackwood understand ownership better than decency. And when this is over, when you found the man you're looking for, then I'll move on, he said simply, but not before making sure you're safe. Nora nodded, a complicated emotion crossing her face. I should let you eat. She turned to leave but paused at the door. Thank you, Mr. Foster. Not many would have done what you did today. After she left, Hayes finished his meal, his thoughts troubled. His plan had been straightforward: arrive quietly, gather information about his brother's killer, and deliver justice. Getting involved with a local dispute complicated matters. Yet seeing Nora Thompson being dragged through the street had sparked something he'd thought long buried, a sense of righteous anger that had defined his years wearing a badge. Sleep came fitfully that night for both of them. Nora tossed in her bed upstairs, her bruised body aching but her mind more occupied with the stranger sleeping below. Hayes kept watch most of the night, alert to any movement outside. Dawn broke with a commotion in the street. Hayes was instantly awake, gun in hand, as Nora rushed downstairs in her nightdress and robe. What's happening? She asked. Hayes peered through the window. Looks like the sheriff's calling a town meeting. They watched as Blackwood, standing on the steps of the town hall, addressed the gathering crowd. Even from a distance, his voice carried. "There's a dangerous criminal in our midst," he shouted. "Hayes Foster is wanted for murder in 3 territories. I'm offering $50 to anyone who helps bring him to justice." Nora turned to Hayes, her face pale. "Is it true?" Hayes's expression remained neutral. "The only men I've killed were those who needed killing, and all while wearing a badge." He met her gaze steadily. "But Blackwood doesn't know I was a lawman. That works to our advantage. How is being accused of murder an advantage? Because it means he doesn't know why I'm really here." Hayes checked his ammunition. "I need to move around town, ask some questions, but first I need to make sure you're safe." "I'm coming with you," Nora declared, straightening her shoulders despite her injuries. "That's not wise. This is my town," she interrupted. "I know who to trust and who to avoid. Besides, a man asking questions alone draws attention. A couple shopping or visiting friends doesn't." Hayes studied her determined face and nodded slowly. "All right. But we stay together, and at the first sign of trouble, we retreat." Within the hour, they left the shop through the back door, Nora now dressed in a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd pinned up neatly. Hayes had removed his trail coat and gun belt, though he kept a smaller revolver concealed in his waistband. They moved casually through the side streets, Nora greeting acquaintances with practiced normalcy while Hayes observed everything with a lawman's eye. Their first stop was the general store where the proprietor, a thin man named Jenkins, eyed them nervously. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," Nora said brightly. "I need some thread and buttons." Jenkins glanced repeatedly toward the street as he gathered her items. "Sheriff's looking for your friend here," he muttered. "Says he's dangerous." "And you believe everything Blackwood says?" Nora asked quietly. Jenkins flinched. "I just mind my business, Miss Thompson." "That's what I'm trying to do as well," Hayes said, stepping forward. "I'm looking for information about a man who passed through here last year, wore fancy clothes, had a scar along his right jaw, might have been asking questions about mining claims." Jenkins paled. "Don't know nothing about that." He pushed Nora's purchases across the counter. "That'll be 15 cents. As they left the store, Hayes frowned. "He knows something." "But he's too afraid to talk," Nora finished, "like most people in this town." They continued their circuit, stopping at the post office and the blacksmith shop, where Hayes repeated his inquiry about the scarred man. Each time he was met with denial and fear. "This isn't working," Nora sighed as they paused in the shadow of the church. "No one will talk with Blackwood's threats hanging over them," Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Then we need to speak to someone who isn't afraid of the sheriff." His gaze drifted toward the far end of town. "What can you tell me about the saloon?" "The Silver Dollar," Nora's expression tightened. "It's where Blackwood does most of his business. The owner, Madeline Hart, is the only person in town who stands up to him." "Then that's who we need to see." Nora shook her head. "I can't go in there. It's not proper." Hayes considered this. "Is there another way to reach this Madeline without going through the front door?" "There's a service entrance in the back alley. The girls who work there use it." "Then that's our path." They made their way carefully around to the alley behind the saloon. The midday sun cast sharp shadows as they approached the back door. Hayes knocked firmly. After a moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a young woman in a performer's costume. Her heavily painted face registered surprise. "Miss Thompson, what on earth are you doing here?" "Hello, Ruby." "We need to speak with Miss Hart. It's important." Ruby's eyes darted to Hayes. "Is this about what happened yesterday? The whole town's talking." "Please, Ruby," Nora pressed. "It's urgent." The girl hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quick. Maddie's in her office." They followed Ruby through a narrow corridor past small rooms where other girls were resting or preparing for the day's business. At the end of the hall, Ruby knocked on a polished oak door. "Enter," called a woman's voice. Madeline Hart was not what Hayes expected. In her early 40s, she possessed a regal bearing that seemed at odds with her surroundings. Her black hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a deep burgundy dress that spoke of wealth and taste. "Nora Thompson," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "I never expected to see you cross my threshold." Her sharp eyes moved to Hayes. "And you must be the mysterious Mr. Foster who has our sheriff in such a state." "Madam," Hayes tipped his hat. "Please sit." She gestured to 2 chairs before her desk. Ruby, bring us some coffee, then make sure we're not disturbed. Once they were settled with steaming cups, Madeline leaned back in her chair. Now, what brings the town's most respectable seamstress and Blackwood's newest enemy to my establishment? Hayes went straight to the point. I'm looking for a man who came through Silvercreek last year. Tall, well-dressed, with a scar along his right jaw, he might have been connected to some mining business. Madeline's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. And why are you looking for this man? He killed my brother, Hayes said flatly, a U.S. Marshal who was investigating corruption in mining claims. Madeline took a slow sip of her coffee. The man you're describing sounds like Maxwell Dean. He was here for about 2 weeks last summer, spending freely and meeting privately with our esteemed sheriff. Nora leaned forward. What were they meeting about? There was talk of a new silver strike in the hills north of town, land that was supposed to be protected by treaties with the Ute. Madeline's mouth tightened. Shortly after Dean left, several Indian attacks were reported. Blackwood led a militia response that left 12 Ute dead. Within a month, mining claims were being staked on their land. Hayes's grip tightened on his cup. My brother was investigating false reports of Indian attacks being used to justify land grabs. If your brother was asking those kinds of questions, I can see why he might have crossed paths with Dean. Madeline set down her cup. Dean works for the Western Mining Consortium. They've been acquiring land all across Colorado by whatever means necessary. Do you know where Dean is now? Hayes asked. He returned to town 3 days ago. He's staying at the Grand Hotel and meeting with Blackwood daily. Madeline gave him a measured look. Whatever you're planning, you should know that Dean never travels alone. He has at least 4 men with him, professional gunmen. Hayes nodded, absorbing this information. I appreciate your candor, Miss Hart. I have no love for Blackwood or his associates, she replied. They represent a type of man I've spent my life avoiding or profiting from. Her gaze shifted to Nora. Which brings me to you, my dear. Blackwood's obsession with you has become dangerous. After yesterday's display, he'll either force you to marry him or destroy you for humiliating him. Nora's face paled, but her voice remained steady. I won't give in to him. Brave, but possibly foolish. Madeline drummed her fingers on the desk. The stagecoach leaves for Denver tomorrow morning. If I were you, I'd be on it. I can't just abandon everything my father built, Nora protested. Better than being buried alongside him, Madeline countered bluntly. Hayes had been quiet, weighing options. If Dean is working with Blackwood, they'll both need to answer for their crimes, but I need evidence linking them to the false Indian attacks and my brother's murder. Madeline considered this. Blackwood keeps records of all his dealings in his office at the jailhouse, and he's due here this afternoon for his usual poker game. The office would be empty except for maybe one deputy. That's my opportunity then, Hayes said. It's too dangerous, Nora objected. If you're caught, sometimes the most direct approach is the safest, Hayes replied. Everyone will expect me to hide or try to leave town. They won't expect me to walk right into the sheriff's office. You're either very clever or completely mad, Madeline observed with a hint of admiration. Been called both, madam. Madeline rose. Ruby will show you out the back way, and Mr. Foster, her expression turned serious. Blackwood is a vicious man, but Dean is something worse. He kills without passion or anger, just cold calculation. Be careful. Back in the alley, Nora grabbed Hayes's arm. You can't seriously be planning to break into the sheriff's office. Not break in, Hayes corrected. Walk in with your help. My help? I need a distraction. Something that will draw any remaining deputies away from the office while I search for evidence. Nora's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You want me to create a scene? Nothing dangerous, Hayes assured her. Just something noticeable enough to pull attention away from the jailhouse for 10 minutes. Nora thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. I know just the thing. They spent the next hour planning carefully. Nora would go to the center of town, near the Mercantile, and stage a very public dispute with Mrs. Wilson over a supposedly ruined dress. The commotion would draw curious onlookers, including any deputies not playing cards with Blackwood. Meanwhile, Hayes would slip into the sheriff's office, find evidence linking Blackwood and Dean to the false Indian attacks and hopefully to his brother's murder, then meet Nora behind the church. As the afternoon sun began its descent, they prepared to put their plan into motion. "Be careful," Nora said, gripping Hayes's hands. "You too." He squeezed her fingers gently. "If anything goes wrong, don't wait for me. Go to Miss Hart. She seems like a woman who can get things done." Nora nodded, fighting a surge of emotion she hadn't expected to feel for this man she'd known barely a day. "Why are you really helping me? This complicates your mission." Hayes's blue eyes held her steadily. "Sometimes doing what's right isn't a choice, it's a necessity." He hesitated, then added more softly, "And sometimes people walk into your life unexpectedly and change everything." Before Nora could respond, he released her hands and stepped back. "It's time. I'll see you at the church in 30 minutes." Nora took a deep breath and headed toward the mercantile, her heart pounding with fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. The plan started perfectly. Nora's performance with Mrs. Wilson, who had enthusiastically agreed to help, drew a substantial crowd. Their animated argument about a supposedly ruined wedding dress quickly escalated in volume, attracting even more attention. "This material cost me a month's savings," Mrs. Wilson cried theatrically, waving a length of fabric. "And you've completely destroyed it." "I did exactly as you asked," Nora countered, hands on hips. "If you didn't want lace on the collar, you should have said so." From the corner of her eye, Nora saw the deputy stationed outside the jailhouse crane his neck to see what the commotion was about. After a moment's hesitation, he abandoned his post and headed toward the growing crowd. Hayes, watching from between buildings, seized his opportunity. With practiced ease, he slipped into the jailhouse, finding it momentarily empty as planned. He moved quickly to the sheriff's office at the back, searching through papers on the desk and in drawers. In the bottom drawer, locked but easily picked with his pocket knife, he found what he was looking for: correspondence between Blackwood and the Western Mining Consortium, detailing payments for security operations in Ute territory. More damning still was a letter from Maxwell Dean authorizing payment for handling the Marshall situation. The date matched the week of Thomas's murder. Hayes quickly tucked the documents inside his shirt and was preparing to leave when he heard the front door open. Ducking behind the door, he watched as Blackwood himself entered, looking agitated. "Stupid women causing a scene," the sheriff muttered, heading straight for the whiskey bottle on his shelf. Hayes weighed his options. He could try to slip out, risking detection, or confront Blackwood directly. The decision was made for him when Blackwood turned and spotted him. "Foster!" The sheriff reached for his gun, but Hayes was faster, drawing his concealed revolver and aiming it steadily. "Don't move, Blackwood. I'm not here to kill you." The sheriff froze, hand hovering near his holster. "Breaking into a lawman's office is a hanging offense. So is conspiring to murder a U.S. Marshal," Hayes countered, pulling the documents from his shirt. "I found your correspondence with Maxwell Dean about handling the Marshall situation. That Marshall was my brother." Blackwood's face darkened. "You can't prove anything. These letters say otherwise." Hayes kept his gun trained on the sheriff. "I'm taking you and Dean to the federal authorities in Denver." Blackwood laughed, a cold sound. "You won't make it out of town alive." "Dean has men watching every road. Then I'll have to improvise." Hayes gestured with his gun, moved toward the cells, slowly. Meanwhile, Nora was growing increasingly concerned. Their performance had drawn the desired crowd, including 2 deputies, but the agreed-upon 30 minutes had passed with no sign of Hayes. Something was wrong. "I need to go," she whispered to Mrs. Wilson during a lull in their fake argument. The older woman nodded slightly. "Be careful, dear." Nora slipped away from the crowd and hurried toward the church, their designated meeting place. Finding it empty, she made a difficult decision and headed cautiously toward the jailhouse, staying in the shadows of buildings. As she approached, she saw movement inside through the window: 2 figures, one clearly Hayes, the other Blackwood. They appeared to be struggling. Without thinking, Nora grabbed a loose board from a nearby construction site and rushed to the jailhouse door. Inside, Blackwood had momentarily gained the upper hand, knocking Hayes's gun aside and landing a solid punch. As they grappled, Nora burst through the door and swung the board with all her strength, catching Blackwood across the back. He staggered, giving Hayes the opening he needed to deliver a knockout blow. The sheriff crumpled to the floor unconscious. "Nora," Hayes exclaimed, "you were supposed to wait at the church." "You were late," she replied simply, dropping the board. "Did you find what you needed?" Hayes quickly secured Blackwood in one of his own cells, then showed her the documents. "Evidence linking him and Dean to the false Indian attacks and possibly to my brother's murder. We need to get these to the proper authorities," Nora said. "That means getting past Dean and his men." Hayes checked Blackwood's gun belt, appropriating extra ammunition. "And we need to move quickly before the deputies return." They slipped out the back of the jailhouse, making their way cautiously toward the livery stable. Hayes planned to secure horses and take the mountain trail north, avoiding the main roads where Dean's men would be watching. But as they approached the livery, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "That's far enough, Foster." Maxwell Dean stepped into view, flanked by two armed men. He was exactly as described, tall, well-dressed, with a prominent scar along his right jaw. His eyes were cold as he trained his pistol on Hayes. "I've been expecting you ever since I heard about the commotion with the sheriff yesterday," Dean said smoothly. "You have your brother's tenacity, I'll give you that. And you have the cowardice of a man who pays others to do his killing," Hayes replied, positioning himself slightly in front of Nora. Dean's smile never reached his eyes. "Business requires delegation, Mr. Foster. Your brother interfered with very profitable arrangements. You're making the same mistake. The only mistake was thinking you could get away with murder." Hayes's hand hovered near his concealed weapon. "I have evidence linking you to false reports of Indian attacks and to my brother's death." "Evidence that will never reach Denver," Dean replied coldly. "Kill them both," he ordered his men. "Make it look like they were trying to escape custody." Time seemed to slow as the gunmen raised their weapons. Hayes drew his revolver in one fluid motion, pushing Nora behind a water trough as the first shots rang out. What followed was a blur of gunfire and shouting. Hayes managed to hit one of Dean's men, but the odds were still against them. Bullets splintered the wood around them as they returned fire from behind their meager cover. Then, unexpectedly, shots came from another direction. Two of Dean's men fell, and Dean himself ducked for cover, looking wildly around. "That's enough bloodshed in my town," came Madeline Hart's authoritative voice. She stood at the corner of the livery, a shotgun in her hands. Behind her were several of her girls, each armed. The distraction gave Hayes the opening he needed. He lined up his shot carefully and fired, catching Dean in the shoulder. The man went down with a cry of pain, his gun skittering across the dirt. As quickly as it had erupted, the gunfight was over. Dean lay wounded but alive, his remaining man surrendering with hands raised. "Perfect timing, Miss Hart," Hayes said, keeping his gun trained on Dean. "I keep an eye on interesting developments," Madeline replied, approaching with her shotgun still ready. "When I saw Dean and his men heading this way, I gathered some assistance." "You'll hang for this," Dean growled, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "I doubt that," Madeline said coolly. "The territorial governor is an old friend. He'll be very interested in these accusations of fraud and murder, especially when they involve treaty violations." By now, the commotion had drawn a crowd, including several deputies who looked uncertain about what to do with their sheriff locked in his own jail and a shootout in progress. "Deputy Collins," Hayes addressed the senior man. "Sheriff Blackwood is under arrest for conspiracy and corruption. I have documents proving he colluded with this man to falsify Indian attacks and seize protected land. As a former U.S. Marshal, I'm placing them both in federal custody." Collins hesitated, looking between Hayes and the wounded Dean. "Former Marshal," Hayes nodded. "Hayes Foster, Colorado Territory. I left the service to find my brother's killer." He pulled out a folded paper from his inside pocket, his marshal's credentials that he'd kept despite resigning his post. The revelation sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Even Nora looked surprised, though she quickly masked it. "I'll need men I can trust to guard the prisoners until the federal marshals arrive from Denver," Hayes continued. "Miss Hart, would your ladies be willing to assist?" Madeline smiled thinly. "Nothing would give us greater pleasure." With Dean and his remaining men secured in the jailhouse alongside Blackwood, Hayes sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Denver. The town remained in an uproar, citizens gathering in small groups to discuss the day's shocking events. Hayes found Nora sitting alone on the steps of the church, staring at the sunset painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Are you all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I should be asking you that," she replied. "You're the one who was in a gunfight." "Not my first," he admitted, "though I hope it might be my last." Nora turned to face him. "You never mentioned you were a marshal." "Former marshal," he corrected. "I resigned my commission to hunt Dean. The authorities wanted to handle it through proper channels." But proper channels move slowly, and guilty men have a way of disappearing. And now, with Dean captured and evidence secured, Hayes gazed out at the darkening sky. "I've completed what I set out to do. Justice for Thomas will come through the courts now." "So you'll be moving on," Nora said quietly, a statement rather than a question. Hayes was silent for a long moment. That was the plan. He turned to look at her, really look at her, the strength in her green eyes, the stubborn set of her chin, the grace with which she'd faced unimaginable hardship. "But plans change." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I rode into Silvercreek, I was only looking backward, seeking vengeance for what I'd lost." He took her hand gently, mindful of her still healing injuries. "I never expected to find something to look forward to." Nora's breath caught. "Hayes." "When I told Blackwood you were mine, it was to protect you," he said softly. "But standing here now, I find myself wishing it could be true in a different way." Tears glistened in Nora's eyes. "We barely know each other." "I know enough," Hayes replied. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you stood up to a corrupt man when the whole town cowered. I know you risked your life to help a stranger seek justice." His voice softened. "And I know that, for the first time since Thomas died, I'm thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay in Silvercreek if I'd be welcome." He held her gaze steadily. "The town will need help rebuilding after Blackwood's corruption, and I find I'm not ready to leave, not when there's a chance for something I never expected to find again." Nora's smile was like the sunrise after the darkest night. "I think you'd be very welcome, Mr. Foster." "Hayes," he corrected gently. "Hayes," she repeated, her voice warm with promise. As the last light faded from the sky, he leaned forward and kissed her softly. A beginning rather than an ending. 3 months later, the territorial court found Maxwell Dean guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Jedediah Blackwood, turning state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirmed that Dean had ordered the killing of Marshal Thomas Foster when he'd gotten too close to exposing their operation. Silvercreek itself was transformed. With Blackwood's corrupt regime dismantled, the town elected a new sheriff, a former deputy named Collins, who had proven his integrity during the transition. Hayes declined the position when it was offered, preferring to accept a different role as circuit judge for the territory, a position that allowed him to remain based in Silvercreek while occasionally traveling to hear cases. Nora's dressmaking business flourished, with orders coming in from as far away as Denver. The shop expanded to include a small haberdashery section, selling men's accessories that Hayes insisted were absolutely essential to proper gentlemanly attire. On a crisp autumn day, with the aspen trees turned to gold on the surrounding mountainsides, Hayes and Nora were married in the small church where they had once hidden from danger. Madeline Hart, now a respected businesswoman focusing on legitimate enterprises, arranged a reception that the town would talk about for years. As they stood together on the porch of their new home built beside the expanded shop, Hayes wrapped his arms around his wife and watched the sunset paint the mountains. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. Nora leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible." She turned in his arms to face him. "When you rode into town that day, I was just trying to survive. I never imagined that the most terrible day could lead to the most wonderful life." Hayes finished, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "Exactly that." She rose on tiptoes to kiss him, still marveling at how natural it felt. "Do you ever regret it, staying here instead of returning to your old life?" Hayes's blue eyes were clear and certain as they met hers. Not for a single moment. The past is settled. Thomas has justice. Now we have tomorrow. He pulled her closer, and every tomorrow after that. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together, no longer defined by what they had endured, but by what they had built, a love forged in adversity, tempered by courage, and now flourishing in the freedom of a future entirely their own.